Welcome back to Vivid Earth, everyone. Tonight I've got Kenneth Scott back with me. Last time we left off, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, we still had a lot of ground to cover, and it felt like we only just got started, but it got a little bit long, and I had other engagements. So I'm excited to have Ken back with us tonight, and we're going to continue our discussion and touch on a few other subjects. And we're going to look at last time we spoke about all the different law forms that Ken is very, very knowledgeable about, and certainly very interesting. And the pillars that kind of uphold the current system that we, living in on this planet, many of which is starting to crumble and crack a little bit. And we're just going to touch on those again. And then we'll see where the conversation leads us. And I think there'll be a few exciting things to discuss in between, along with current events. Welcome, Ken. How are you?
Very good, Anina. Thank you. Good to be back with you.
Yeah. So tell us, Scott. Why I'm calling you Scott Ken.
That's okay.
um, where we left off the last time in terms of the structures that uphold this system that we're living under.
Yeah.
Let's continue from there.
Okay. Well, as you said, we talked about different law forms. We talked about common law, the misinterpretation of what many who are seeking to use law to the people's benefit. A lot of that is focused on common law. And what I discussed with you last time is the fact that people don't understand how the whole system of law is really constructed. And obviously, it's constructed to be discombobulating, misdirection, people who are not initiated in how law really is constructed. And that actually includes most of the bar attorneys. They're trained and programmed to operate within the confines of the public system, codes and statutes, commercial law, civil infractions, criminal infractions or felonies and so forth. But people have not been trained or educated as to how all of the systems of law, the different jurisdictional law forms, really work and interconnect together. And so this is what I've studied for 35 years and have developed in my own capacity, my own awareness, an integrated whole system of knowing how it all works and fits together. And as I've mentioned in all of our interviews that this is what we teach in PanTerra Vida in the Gem and Gemstone University. And it takes time. It takes a commitment. It takes a consistency to really study. And this is why we created PanTerra and the Gemstone University in the first place, to have a steady grounding point where people can be and working with others, studying and be guided in the systematic development of a whole system awareness of how it's all put together. It's what I've called for many years developing a decoder ring, being able to decode whether it's current events and understanding how current events are driven and or historical events or building blocks of the legal system, the law system, and so forth. So where we left off is in our last meeting was I said I was going to go back to the basics, and what are the foundational building blocks going back thousands of years. And as I have mentioned here in our discussions and in many other places, that I've studied history very extensively and specifically the history of religion. Religion is the backbone of the world system. We all know that, or those who pay attention. Religion is used to create symbology, esoteric systems, structures that the initiated are aware of and use to their benefit and to the cabal system, moving that system forward towards its ultimate goal. And we all know that its ultimate goal is domination, control of everything, owning the planet, owning all the people, controlling them, and actually controlling them as they are oblivious to where that control really consists of or exists behind what we perceive. So going back to those origins, there's a fundamental building block in the Masonic system, the esoterica. It's in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. It's everywhere in our world system, and most people don't have the eyes to see it or understand it and be aware of it. And that is the image of two pillars and a arch that connects the two pillars. If you go into the book of Genesis, it refers to the two pillars. There are two words or two names that are used for those two pillars. It's Joachim, spelled Joachim in English, and Boaz. And some people pronounce it a little bit different, Joachim or Joachim, or variations of that. And I actually looked up the origins of those two names, those two words, and essentially, I don't quite remember exactly where they came from. One was a Sumerian, perhaps the other was an Egyptian word, maybe Babylonian, but essentially transliterated into English, they translate into a phrase, for he that we wait for. And that's sort of the central structure, the central theme. As I mentioned, it's in Genesis. It's very much part of the Masonic system, and it's part of architecture. As I said, there's two pillars and there's an arc. If you look at the different images from masonry, what people call it workings, where you have an image of the black and white checkered floor, and you have different things in there like a ladder, the sun, or the sun and the moon, and the two pillars, and actually often a third pillar. This is a primary image, and it's part of the initiatory process of learning the symbols, learning where they come from, and learning how to understand them and work with them to one's advantage. And taking that forward, well, before I go there, where did that originate? Well, the whole world system, the religious system, the political system, the esoteric and symbology system, is oriented around astrotheology, around the zodiac, around the sun, the moon, the cycles, the mathematics, and so forth. And at the current moment, in our reality, relative to the movement of the sun in something that we call an annuation or a solar return, a year cycle, we have 3 points, actually 4, but 2 of them are exactly the same. There are 2 solstices, summer and winter, and there's equinoxes, 2 equinoxes that occur at the same point. Well, in ancient times, when temples were being built, were being laid out and planned, they would take a rod or a stick, and they would stand on a flat plain in an area where they knew they were going to build a temple. And during, at the moment of an equinox or the moment of each of the 2 solstices, they would have a shadow at the rising of the sun, or Horus rising, the rising of the prodigal son, and all that relates to sun, S-U-N, sun, S-O-N, and all of that has become the backbone and the framework of Western religion for thousands of years. And so at the equinoxes, that shadow would be a straight line. That straight line was the orientation. This is why in Romance languages, Spanish and otherwise, and in English, the East is called the Orient, because it was an orientation to the rising of the sun on the equinox. That would be your straight line coming into what would be the entry point of the proposed or planned temple. Then you go to the 2 solstices, and they would create an angle shadow. Those 2 angles would cross where the center line was, and where they created two fixed points is where the entry pillars would be placed. So if you imagine that you have a straight line, you have two angular lines, and where those angles cross each other and then create a fixed point, that's where the entryway to the temple would be built. You can look at the way the Vatican, St. Peter's Square is built, and you have the obelisk in the center, which is really a solar clock, and how those angles are created. You can see that very easily. In fact, where St. Peter's Square is and how it's constructed, it's a big key, and it's a key to opening the inner chambers of the esoterica and all that represented. And we see it everywhere. We see it in architecture. You see the two pillars. I mean, it's virtually everywhere in many, many variations. So what are those two pillars? Well, they represented two lines of power and control. One is the line of the king. The other is the line of the priest. And you can certainly look throughout history as we know it for thousands of years, and those are the two primary power positions that were embodied or held by men, and those became the doctrination or the indoctrinating of the world system as it related to the line of the king, who controlled the land, and the line of the priest, who controlled the law. And if you think of it, the control of those two things is what everything else is built on in terms of creating a externalized, very complex system of dominance and control through the control of the land and the control of the law. So as we talked about common law is the law of the land. Well, as I also said, almost all people have no standing on the land. If you look at the history of, say, the last 500 years, as things started maturing in Europe, you have something that emerged in the Holy Roman Empire, which was the prince electors. So all the princes from specific bloodlines in Germany, Central Europe, going back hundreds of years, you had upwards of 300 principalities. Principality means there is a prince who is the sovereign who controls that portion of the land. This migrated and was integrated into the English system, and the English system through the British Empire extended around the whole planet and essentially implemented this throughout the world system. When the United States was founded and created, if you look at a document which is called the Treaty of Versailles of 1783, which is often referred to as the Treaty of Peace, supposedly establishing the peace between the British and the Americans, that the opening refers to the, I forget the exact word, but the magnificent hearts, that's not the right word, but the multiple hearts of King George III, and it enumerates that he's the King of England, the King of France, the Prince of Brunswick and Lunenburg, which were two German principalities, and he's the Prince Elector and the Arch Treasurer of the Holy Roman Empire and the United States of America. So that established that perpetual succession of the crown was in control of the United States of America as one of the Crown Corporation possessions. And it had to do with the money system, the arch treasurer, and it had to do with the land, the prince electors. Out of that was formulated the Electoral College. And the Electoral College was specifically about those who had standing on the land. So it's all about the control of the land through the lineage going back to Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, post-Babylonian period into the Roman period, the Roman Empire, which we are still living in, and all the way to the Triple Crown and the three city-states that control the world, and how the population through the implementation, which we talked about last time, of the bankruptcy, military occupation, admiralty and maritime law, and how that relates to essentially the containment field of lifting the people off the land and putting them into a civil body. Because in the admiralty, which controls bankruptcy, the control of the body politic and the control of the bankrupt estate has to do with the management of the persons and the property that are in the containment field in the lifting off of the land, which in feudal times was referred to as the serfs, the landless peasants, who had no standing whatsoever. And that's our condition today. So basically, the line of the priest is the line of the law. How the control of the law, which was originally structured and integrated in a religious context in terms of what one had to do to follow the law of the priest, to follow the law of the cycles, essentially the deification of the solar cycle, the moon cycle, the astrotheological cycle with the stars, the constellations, and all of that. And the priests, which were the scientists, also knew how to use those cycles, the time cycles, the solar cycle, to know when to plant, know when to harvest, setting up holidays, holy days in which certain things were done. The solar eclipse cycle, the lunar eclipse cycle, all of that to create a mystical hierarchy between the law of the priest, who were the scientists who controlled the temple in which the god or gods resided, through the entry point of coming in through the two pillars down down the aisle and into the essentially the two hemispheres of the brain on the left side and the right side, coming down to the altar, which really was a representation of the female reproductive organ. So the entry of the churches in their reticulated layers, and the vesica piscis, essentially the vaginal entry in which the people are entering into this holy domain of the priests and the gods as a form of semination, so that they would come down the aisle through the left side, right side of the brain, and they would go to the altar where they would be altered into seedlings to become members of the congregation and to be bound to the law of the priest. That evolved eventually into the Roman period, into the temples becoming also the banks. So where was the safest place in those times to bank your wealth? Well, they were the temples, because they were sacrosanct. They were controlled by the fear of the priest, the fear of the law, the fear of the gods, and all the rest of it. And so the temples and the banks and the monetary system were essentially fused together. And in Roman times, the Grand Boulevard, where those temples that were simultaneously the banks, what the name of that boulevard was called Janus, Janus. Or if you put an apostrophe between the J and the A, and an apostrophe between the U and the S, J is a derivative of the article the. J has been used that way, H has been used that way, and so forth. It really says it's Anus Boulevard, to control the temples and the banks and the monetary system. And the nature of Janus as a Roman god was he was the two-faced god, okay? And in the temples and the banks on the Janus Boulevard, when the doors were open, that meant Rome was at war. When the doors were closed, that meant Rome was standing in peace. So now in our modern banking system that is essentially controlled by the law of the priest, which controls the law, the codified system, the civil code, the civitas body lifted off the land, who have been now characterized as enemies of the state, in the 20th century, starting with the Trading with the Enemy Act, going through in 1933 something called the Emergency Banking Relief Act that amended the Trading with the Enemy Act to say that any person within the jurisdiction of the United States or subject thereto essentially is an enemy of the United States. So when the Federal Reserve System was globalized and it became the underlying backbone of the entire temple of the monetary system, the banking system, the Janus system, essentially all people on the planet are characterized as enemies of the state. So when the banks open their doors at 8, 9, or 10 o'clock in the morning, they are Roman Janus temples of the monetary system. Rome is at war with the people. So when the doors are open, you can go in, you do your deposits, your withdrawals, your banking, whatever you are dealing as you're dealt with as an enemy combatant that is entirely controlled by the law of the priest that is extrapolated into the monetary codes, into the medical codes, into the legal codes, the city ordinance codes. Every code on the planet essentially is the law of the priest that controls the people contained in the temple, who are nothing more than the inseminating individuals who come in and are altered at the altar and then become essentially property of the state. Now, when the banks close their doors, Rome is at peace, and that's where during the nighttime, from whenever they close, 5 o'clock at night till the next morning's opening, I won't go into the detail right now, but suffice it to say that this is when all the banks, it's like the vampires come out at night. They are doing all the machinations of the macro scale, overnight trading, everything you've ever heard the phrases of, but you don't really know what that really means. Overnight lending, providing liquidity so that every bank can close its doors at closing time with the public, and it could balance its books, even if it has no capital base that actually is balanced, because the whole thing's a Ponzi scheme. But they trade back and forth, and they provide liquidity so each individual bank can balance its books until the next morning, while it opens it up again and goes to war back against the people. And they're making all kinds of quote unquote money by doing that, when that money has no relationship to the real physical world or to the people who are actually creating the wealth around the world. So that's the line of the priest. That's the law of the priest. The line of the king is about controlling the land. If you go back into Sumerian, Egyptian, Babylonian time, you have something called the descent of kingship. And the descent of kingship was essentially the demiurge granting its divine power to its bloodline lineages, that they will hold the power of the king, the power of the crown. And only in the king or the crown is vested the absolute sovereign control of the land. And as that evolved through thousands of years, coming into the feudal system was where the grant of land by a king or a pope vested lords of the land or lords of the manor their sovereign estates through a oath of fealty. Fealty means loyalty, in which the landlord pledged his production, his men at arms, money, weapons, food, whatever, to maintain the sovereign control by the king of the land in fealty, so that they can basically control the land and then control the estates, lift everybody, all the people, the landless peasants, the servants, off of the land and into the containment field. And that goes back to Roman civil law, which is the law of the military conqueror. So this is why Europe is in Roman civil law. This is why Latin America is in Roman civil law, because Latin America was conquered through the Holy Roman Empire, through the crown of Spain and in part the crown of Portugal, And essentially, this is a world system of the sovereign with fealty to the crown and ultimately to the Pope and the Vatican to control all of the land. So this is what the two pillars represent. The arch essentially is the arch of Anu, and progressively it became the arch of Yahweh, the Old Testament God who bound his people, who then extrapolated that out to the Judeo-Christian system, to the sovereign control of the Godhead represented by the arch. That's why you have archangels, architecture, all of these things that control the physical realm through the two pillars. So so basically, this is what binds the two pillars together is the absolute authority of the gods that eventually became the God, the Yahweh, the monotheistic control system through the three primary expressions of that, through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to bind the people to the law of the priest, which is both religious and secular and civil.
Very interesting. Just give me 1 sec. That was fascinating, Ken. I mean, there's so many questions that come up just doing that piece of information. So essentially, we are still living in a system that was created in the time of the Anunnaki, right? So they created that system, and yes, the system kind of evolved a little bit over the years, but it's still built on the same pillars and the same principle of what it was built then. So what I wanted to ask also, since it's been in place for so many thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years, essentially, how long will it take to actually dismantle the system? Number one. And number two, a lot of these esoteric concepts we know has been inverted and hijacked. And how do we take back control over those elements that make up our existence, but the mere thought of them now is like, we don't want any part of it. But essentially, those are esoteric principles that life itself is based on. So how do we take those back? How long is it going to take us to undo all of this? And how are we taking all of those esoteric principles back? And I think a lot of people do not understand how the two interact. And you've described that beautifully, because to know the law, to know the systems, to know what's been going on this planet for so many years, you have to know the esoteric side of it as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the hang on, I gotta clear my throat for a well, a phrase that we use continually and have for decades, that really is the essence of the work upon us, is that the only way out is in. Trying to change it externally, and by out we mean out of the entrapment of our true creator capacity, what people call the matrix, the systemic mind control, because what most people operate with and through is what they perceive or think is the mind, which is their mind. It's really the mechanical mind that is an external insert of a control matrix. It's the AI system, and it's the methodology and the pathway or the tool by which the insertion of holographic inserts, astral overlays, possession, all of those things. Most people on this planet are stuck in the mind, and they're not really grounded in the physical. They are not in the body. The body is an extraordinary, as I'm sure you know, and many of your viewers know, is an extraordinary creation. We are an extraordinary individuated expression of creation. We are the creators of this reality, but we are running somebody else's movie, and that movie comes through that mind construct. And actually, in the New Age spiritual paths, everybody refers to consciousness. but consciousness is actually the mind consciousness system. It's not the true organic mind that is both universal and eternal, by which, within which, and as which we are really creating this reality. And the masters of the realm, they know this extremely well. This is what is taught in the esoteric systems of how to control the people. And we can, for those who've really moved themselves to be educated of world events in recent history, the last 100 years or the last 500 years, we know very well that mind control, systemic control, MK Ultra, that's been extrapolated into a mass consciousness control mechanism through the media, through fear, through survival mechanisms, all of those things, the indoctrination system. That's all the mechanical mind. So we are programmed and trained and entrained, especially now with these devices and all the entertainment or the entrainment of the digital reality that we're so, most of the population so addicted to, that we all think that the external reality is what we have to change. It's not what we have to change. What we have to change is ourselves and our relationship to it. And that takes a lot of hard work. That's why a fundamental building block of our work in PanTerra is the inner work. But the inner work, they're again going through the history of the last 100 or so years of the emergence of the New Age system, that there's this in many cases, extreme focus on the internal, which is not another way of mind consciousness programming, which has to do with self-focus and aligning with things that are really effectively pure fantasy. And I know this very well. I'm 71 years old. I walked very much through the New Age reality, the metaphysical reality in the 60s, 70s, and onward, and came to know it extremely well, ultimately, as just another cyclical control mechanism. Basically, this planet, this population goes through New Age belief systems every 2,000 years. Christianity is the New Age belief system of 2,000 years ago. Go back another 2,000 years, and it's the Isis Osiris mystery cult. And you go back another 2,000 years, and it's the Mithraic cult and the cult of the bull and the Taurus age and so forth. So New Age is nothing new. It's another control mechanism. So it's neither all in within inward looking or all out external looking. It's a balance between the two. And so many in spiritual paths reject getting involved in the world to understand it. You say, well, the political structure, the religious structure, all these things, well, that has nothing to do with me. That's not true. It has everything to do with us. These are the hidden control mechanisms that most people, even very well educated in spiritual terms, do not know what's really controlling the system they exist in. So our work as we pursue it is infusing our awareness, our being, and our being presence into understanding all of this in order to transmute it, transform it, and resolve it. And as we do that within the external projected reality, it has a corresponding influence or directive motion into the transformation within ourselves. Because we can look at the esoterica, we can look at the two pillars and the arch and understand that's just how it's been mirrored from our internal standing reality capacity, that we are the law. But it's not the law of the priest. It's not a hierarchical law. It's not the law of religious canon law or ecclesiastical law or all the isms and secularized law systems. It's basically universal law. The principles of universal and eternal creation, as it always has been, always will be, as it is always eternally unfolding, but expanding in creative expression, that we actually are the law. Everything that is externalized that has been structured into symbology and esoteric structures and imagery and iconography, all those things, they are actually feeble, externalized, mirroring, obverse conversion of who we really are. So it's a matter of taking the law within us. It's not a matter of overthrowing the law or doing something external, although that's still in balance, an important part of what we're doing here. But it's a matter of establishing who we are as embodied living beings, eternal beings who are in source connected to universal law, creational principles, and all of those principles, universal law, they're in every religious text in form. They're in the Bible, they're in, Eastern religions and so forth. But those are all constructed as basically disinformation tools. A lot of principles are there. The ethics of, say, Christianity that obviously are very balanced and equitable. Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Love thy neighbor as you would be loved. Things like that. These are universal principles, but feathered into, interwoven into those so-called holy scriptures are the control mechanisms, are the control via the law of the priests that bind the people through oaths, through rites, through rituals, and everything else that we know about religious structure. And so it takes discernment. It takes a decoder ring to really do the inner work to align with those principles without being hooked into the dogma or the ritualistic disciplines that become the control mechanism through the law of the priest. And then as far as the land, we have integrated the work to walking the path to re-grounding ourselves in the land, and it has to do with both the law form, the legal system, what you know that my work is about status correction and teaching how the law is structured, all the things we talked about last time with the different law forms, and basically in effect, infusing our being into the awareness of how it's constructed, not getting caught up in either fear or, super ego consciousness of trying to become the king of your castle, or I'm doing this, that, or the other. I'm taking the law into my hands, but walking the path of embodying the actual grounding in the land. It does take law form and work. This is what status correction is all about. And PanTerra is very unique in our approach to it because through my work of 35 years, the integration of all the multiplicity of the law forms, what we talked about last time, is part of the education. And part of it is being aware of who you are, where you are at any given time, whether it's a road stop with a policy enforcement officer known as a policeman, or a magistrate, which is a magi, which is a magician, commonly referred to as the judge. What is happening in that room called a courtroom? Where the two pillars exist, and where is the ancient law form of Baal and the bailiff and the magistrate, doing his magic to control you and entrain you or entrance you into acceding to his authority. Well, knowing how that works is very important. Doing that work, walking the path, doing the work of healing ourselves at all levels: karmic healing, trauma healing, biological healing, parasite detoxing, chemical detoxing, all of that. It opens up more space within the unlimited universe that we embody as a microcosm of the whole, the larger whole, the universal whole, where universal law is always present. So when we do status correction, It has to do with reclaiming our standing in our living estate and reclaiming our body, flesh, blood, bones, genetics, and calling in all of the fragments of who we are through all the iterations of false realities that have been done over, timelines and false universes and all the black magic that's been done for eons of time in this realm, calling that all in and growing our inner capacity, which basically we refer to the body as the landed estate. So if you look at law, the landed estate in the traditional reality, the English law form, the feudal system, the landed estate was what was granted by the sovereign, the king, holding the authority and the sovereign standing of the land, doing land grants made patent by letters patent to the landlords, who gave the king a reciprocal oath of fealty, and then always back to the Pope, that they referred to the landed estate as the land that they titled, and that title was an earl or a duke or a prince or a baron. Those are landed estate titles, the so-called landed gentry, but that's an externalization, okay? We are the landed estate. Well, what is landing in this body is our true and authentic self, our true eternal being, that they have worked to separate us through all the trauma, collective trauma, ancestral trauma, personal trauma, physical trauma, emotional trauma, psychic trauma, all of that. What is the actual functional result of that is separating our being from this body. Everything is about dangling the carrot. If you follow the law of the priest, you will be granted entry to heaven. If you don't, you will be excommunicated, you will be shunned, you will be sent into the forest to be eaten by the wolves, whatever it is. You'll be burned at the stake as a heretic. The word heretic comes from a Greek word that essentially translates to choice. So a heretic is one who attempts to choose something different than the law of the priest, the binding of oneself to the priest. And so the only way out is in. It can be seen in multiple ways, one of which is we have to come in. We don't have to go out anywhere. We don't have to be saved. We don't have to be granted entry to heaven. We don't have to be, whatever the metaphor, New Age or otherwise. We just have to regain the standing within ourselves, and that gains, re-establishes our grounding as the true law and the true land of the both the body and of the actual planetary body. So in the model that we have built over the last 30 years in PanTerra, and I think I've talked to you about before, but to reiterate that in the last 500 to 700 years, in the English law form, which has been adopted through the geopolitical over hundreds of years, and that it became a doctrine that has become universally accepted, the law of nations written in the 1750s through the 1770s, that fundamentally a nation is established as a society first. And the definition of a society in the book or the volumes of the Law of Nations is defined as a group of men. Of course, it was always men back there, but we'll just say a gathering of living beings who come together for a common purpose and to bind themselves together by a common intention, common form. That's what a society is. And that came out of the city of London, and what was the original forms in London that were the guilds and the fraternities and the liveries. And this was externalized worldwide through the English law form. So every nation that we call a nation or a country as an estate under the global estate controlled by the papacy was first a society.
Disclosing the keep talking.
Okay. So these are the things that I studied years ago and over the last 20 years. And this is the basis of which we formed PanTerra as a private society. And there's many other types of societies, the American Cancer Society, the Society of Jesus in the religious form. Societies are everywhere, both in secular law, religious law, political law of nations form, and all of that. And a society has the authority and the capacity to establish its own law form, its own court, its own treasury, its own monetary issue, its methodology of relationships with other societies, and its own jurisdiction. So that's what we've built in PanTerra over the last 20 years. And we've built a law form that includes creating out of our own court, based on our law form, a new type of an estate, because worldwide, all property is held in estates. In the elite level, these are what are called SKVs, or the living beneficiary estate, the landed estates of the gentry. And the definition of a SKV is the life by which an estate is measured, which means that Earl whatever, Hampton, Prince of Wales, Duke of Hazards, whatever. He's the SKV. He holds that title of the land as a dukedom, an earldom, a baronet, or whatever. And for as long as he's alive, he is that title. He is that estate. When he dies, it passes to the next beneficiary, who becomes the living beneficiary, usually the firstborn son. And that's what a SKV is. That's mirrored in the public system, where every franchise, every juristic person, which is the name and the birth certificate account and all of that, they are called decedent estates. Decedent means dying. It doesn't mean dead. Deceased means dead. So we are working as a decedent estate in the commercial realm, creating value that then becomes monetized and controlled by the law of the priest. And we are lifted off the land because we have no standing in the land, because we've accepted the franchise, which is a bankrupt, and a bankrupt has no standing. So we are continually creating value. All of the equitable interest gets transferred to the underlying estate, which we abandoned, or our parents abandoned soon after birth, and we've never reclaimed. So all of these are the steps in status correction that we have put together. It's very extensive. It's about infusing our being into knowing the law and knowing how to walk through it, and knowing how to preserve the integrity of your universal standing within true law, not the law of the priest. And so, and then also creating a private estate within our law form and court system. So the point of all of this, when you ask the question, well, what is the work that we can do, is by our reversing the reversal, because everything is a mirrored obverse of the true template of life that we hold and embody, and we should be standing in and as we do this work, we are walking through the process of transmuting, transforming, and resolving all of the attachments, all of the control mechanism in the mechanical mind, the mind consciousness system, and all of that. And we are re-embodying the law, because we have our physical and our say etheric and spiritual being here within this containment field. It's a hologram. It's based on a holographic technology that, as we do that work internally, the inner work, it reciprocally ripples out and it begins to transform. And it doesn't even begin anymore. We began it long ago. It is picking up, accelerating, and exponentializing to where the false matrix is less and less being supported by our entrainment into their movie, and it's imploding on itself. We can see it all around. It's more frenzied in the chaos of the external world, with war, economic collapse, and all these things. But in effect, what's substantiating through our being and our collective unity in walking this process together, what's substantiating is emerging a new reality that will, as the old one collapses, become one in alignment with universal law and our living presence.
Fascinating. Yeah, so indeed, one could say we live in a holographic reality, and when we know the rules of the game and we change how we react to it, well, then the game changes, right? uh, we can
Well,
break the code of
preferably we don't react to it. That's how the mind is programmed, to always react to it. The reaction takes us into the mechanical mind, into the hive mind, and the pre-programmed direction that reaction is designed to take us. So our real standing is, and this is reflected in law, is going into reintegration and balance with our whole being. That's balancing the feminine principle, the masculine principle, and which of course has been split and polarized against itself. And so this is a principle in law, because in my work in studying law, going through all the commercial so-called solutions and remedies in the 90s, leading to secured party creditor work, which was all commercial, it was all still going to war. It was all about becoming the enemy that had been structured in the Trading with the Enemy Act and the Emergency Banking Relief Act that posited all the living beings, men or women or children, as a juristic, which means a legal construct person that was the enemy of the state. And so most people are trained and programmed to react to the system and fight it. When you stop fighting it and you know the law and you know a path, or you are guided on a path to balance it out, internalize it, and knowing how the world system, when the law of the priest and law of the king works, that you essentially neutralize their ability to control. And so reaction, and I know you just said that's just, you know, not purposely, but I just want to be
well, the way to
precise.
react is not to react, right? To be the
Yeah,
neutral
yeah,
observer.
exactly. Yeah, it's to go to peace, but having the tools and understanding their legal system. See, and yeah, looking at, again, etymology in words, what is the origin or the etymology of the word legal? Leg. Well, it relates to the word liege. And in the relationship between the landlord and the master lord, or the sovereign with the crown, that master lord, crown holder, was known or referred to as the liege lord. So oaths of fealty had to do with abiding by the binding law of the king and the control through the king of the land. And standing behind him was the control of the system through the law of the priest. So everybody took on oaths of allegiance, which is a derivative of the word allegiance or legislation or legal. These are all derivative terms with a root that essentially relates to religion, where the root is religion, religare, which means to bind oneself. So by oaths and allegiance and our every act of taking on and reiterating and reaffirming contracts every single day, we are effectively creating oaths of allegiance, oaths of fealty to a sovereign through a national flag. Here in America, when we grew up in the 50s and 60s, we went to school. Every single day we said Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. But who were we actually pledging allegiance to? Well, the flag was a derivative of the Company of Merchants trading in the East Indies, commonly known as the British East India Company. And that's who the flag we were pledging allegiance to. And that was the original construct from the 1770s when the flag was adopted through the Constitution into the 1850s. And in the 1850s, that singular entity of the British East India Company controlling the United States of America as the bankrupt with obligations of monetary contract to the crown, that was separated and split in half. One half went to something called the Virginia Land Company. The other went to New York and became the Metropolitan of New York. And the word metropolitan that we take so easily as, oh, well, it's the Metropolitan of LA, New York, whatever. That's a title of the Archbishop, who was there to oversee the methodology of the control of the Roman Curia and the ecclesiastical canon law that was the law of the priest. So the law of the priest went to New York. Eventually, the Bank of Janus became the Federal Reserve banking system. And the codification of the control mechanisms of the code that bound through Roman civil law, which is the law of the military conqueror, followed the waterway from New York. You have this canal belt called the Erie Canal that connected to the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes, basically as a continuous waterway, went to the shores of Chicago. And on the shores of Chicago, at the address of 1313, I think it was 16th Avenue, is something called Metro. Most people don't know what Metro is. Look it up. In fact, it's probably not even available to find on the internet. It's probably been scrubbed. But Metro was founded in the early 1900s, and out of Metro comes all of the uniform laws or uniform acts, including the Uniform Commercial Code, the Uniform Identity Code, the Uniform Transportation Code, all of the uniform acts that all 50 states had to, after they were converted to corporate subdivisions of the bankrupt United States, they had to adopt. All of these are the code of the priest that became the codified system that then was adopted worldwide through all the bankrupt system and in variations and so forth. And of course, the Uniform Commercial Code controls the code of the money. And the money is in the banks of Janus, which are the temples that control the religion and the bondage to the law of the priest. So this is a systematic disbursement of these two fundamental principles of the two pillars controlled by the ark or the arch of the God, Yahweh, throughout the entire world system over thousands of years. Ain't that just fun?
Fascinating. That's a really, really good breakdown. Now, a lot of people are waiting for things to change. They know a glimpse of what you've just spoken about here, and they're waiting for everything to be changed. They're waiting for somebody to change it. You know, the white hats, the military operation globally. What would you say to them?
Educate yourself. Know the law, know the history, know the everything we've talked about, know separate your emotional attachment to what you think is real relative to whatever flavor of the law of the priest that you're adhered to. Okay, that could be traditional religion, understanding that the universal principles that you were resonating with in your true being and your emotional connection, whether it's the Bible or any other text or New Age text or whatever, those are real. That's your real, true uh, emotional body that is linked up to your higher principle, your true and authentic self, your eternal being, all of that. You resonate to what's real. But most people have lost the capacity to discern or to have a decoder ring to separate the real from the unreal, from the narrative, the overlay. So studying all of these things is very important. That's why we created PanTerra, we created Gemstone University, because this is my life's passion. I've been doing it for close to 70 years. I was motivated when I was 3, 4, 5 years old to start figuring it out. And that's what I've been doing for, say, 65 or so years. And when I started studying law in late 80s, 1991, that the beginning of studying law was what started galvanizing and really solidifying my capacity to see multidimensionally and my ability to integrate many what normally are disparate, meaning separate, pathways of knowledge or education or whatever. So I've gone into pretty much all of them. And my nature is to see all of the dynamics that connect everything, how it all fits together. So I don't reject religion per se. I study it, I go into it, I see where the kernels of truth, universal principles are, I see where the control mechanisms are, and all the rest of it. So my recommendation is to start separating oneself from the entrainment through the mind of the belief systems or the dogmas or the doctrine embodying this, and start really bringing back home into one's own being the real principles, and start integrating it. And if you're so inclined, come join us in PanTerra and get the benefit of my 60 years plus of study, and now hundreds and hundreds of our members who've been with us for some 1 year, some 10 years, and so forth. And collectively, we have been building and integrating all of this into a coherent and comprehensive education to see how it all fits together. So that's our secret to making sense of the world and all the world events going on at this time, and how we, re-embody our landed estate and redirect our creative capacity into what is real. And what is real is the integrity of life and all living beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, PanTerra Vida Society, I have a practical question for you. You know, a lot of what sort of a starting point once you have a grip on basic foundation of information is to do a status correcting. How practical is that on you run a global organization or society based in the US, but how practical is that, for people in different regions of the world doing that status correction? Because practically in their country, it will need to be applied on a local level.
Yes, that's a good question. So principally, there's 4 basic law forms in the world at this time. There's a lot of sub-levels of it, but essentially there's English common law, there is Roman civil law, there is hang on a second. Yeah, English common law.
Maritime law, constitutional law.
Well, there's the uniqueness of what began as English common law, the uniqueness of the American or the United States constitutional system. So there's American English law, common law, there's the Commonwealth English common law, there's Roman civil law, and there's Sharia law. Okay. So if you take, not counting Sharia law, you take those 3. At this point, the grounding point of the world system is the United States American system, which is based on American English common law, but was transformed over the last 100 years into Roman civil law. Well, actually, the last 200 years. And as I've said in this meeting and in our previous discussions, that Roman civil law is the law of Roman military conquest. So you have the Roman conquest of Europe, primarily Europe, and so all of Europe, except for the UK, is under Roman civil law. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that the Holy Roman Empire, then the emperor position was transferred to the King of Spain in 1520, Carlos V, who was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, who the myth says that they funded Christopher Columbus. And there's a lot of background to that. And that goes back to the 1400s, the 1300s, the papal bulls of the doctrine of discovery and all of that. But essentially, Roman civil law became the law from basically Tijuana to Tierra del Fuego, all of Latin America. So you have a large part of the world already overtly in Roman civil law, the law of Roman conquest. Then you have in 1803, 1804, you have the Napoleonic Wars going on, the first phase of it in the early 1800s in Europe, and you have something called the Louisiana Purchase. And so the United States bought supposedly all the Louisiana territory. Technically, the only thing they actually bought at that specific time was the metropolitan area of New Orleans. And so New Orleans retained Roman civil law through the French form of it that was structured. It was the next advancement of Roman civil law that previously was known as Justinian law. And in 1804, the emergence of the Napoleonic Code came about. Okay, it was issued by Napoleon. It was attached to New Orleans. New Orleans was a territory through purchase of the United States in its proper jurisdiction district in the early 1800s before post-Civil War. And that's how Roman civil law gained a foothold on the American continent, the North American continent. So, and the Napoleonic Code was basically an upgrading and a more refined coding of the Roman civil law, or the Justinian Code. One element in the Napoleonic Code was the introduction of what we call the surname. The surname is a Roman construct that has to do with the lord of the land, so that you have the Earl of Hampton, the Duke of Wales, whatever. That became the surname of the royal house, or the house of the lord, the landlord, with the oath of fealty going up to the British Crown and then back to the Pope. So this is why we don't use the so-called family name, surname, when we're doing certain proper law acts and forms and steps in the status correction process, because that attaches us back to Roman civil law, okay, or the law of the conquered people. And when New York in the early 1870s formed the New York Civil Code, and then California adopted in whole, which was against the California Constitution of 1849 or 1850, they adopted the Civil Code of New York, and New York attached that Civil Code to New Orleans. And this is where you have the attachment of the Civil Code, the Roman law of conquest, through New York, where the law of the priest transferred, as I described, from the city of Washington to the Virginia Land Company controlling the land, and then to New York to control the law and metro and all of that, and eventually the Federal Reserve System, putting the Roman civil system into the use of Federal Reserve notes, which became universally the reserve currency through the Bretton Woods agreements in the 1940s. This is how the law of the priest, the Roman conquest of civil law, civil code, was externalized to cover the whole world. So, so in the banking system, the monetary system, when we go into the banks and we put our name on there with the surname that attaches to the Roman Civil Code through the Napoleonic Code, we are basically confessing to be an enemy of the state and accepting license to be able to use their private military script called Federal Reserve notes, or the extrapolation of that, the derivatives called Australian dollars, Mexican pesos, etc. And then you have something called the Hurricane Katrina. Remember Hurricane Katrina? Sort of.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay. So when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, which was actually the third attempt for them to steer a massive hurricane into the metropolitan area of New Orleans. If you look at the history the year before, in 2000 and was it 2004? Yeah, that there's a hurricane called Ivan that came close to New Orleans, missed it, went through Mississippi, went up the landmass, exited somewhere around Georgia or South Carolina, came around, was steered back around Florida, and came back and tried a second hit to hit New Orleans, but they missed the second time because they couldn't retain the power of the first pass. So the next year they amplified Katrina and they guided it through weather control into New Orleans, and they had this mass emergency, these big floods and everything that happened there. And for the first 10 days or so, the governor of Louisiana refused to allow FEMA to come in and take federal control. And they just sat and let it happen. Let people die. They were shooting people. There was all kinds of mess. Finally, the federal government came in and declared a national emergency via FEMA in the control of the metropolitan area called New Orleans, which had retained the foothold of Roman civil code since 1803 when it was bought and created as a United States territory. Once they did that, Roman civil law became the overlay to control the entire continent, and through the continent, through the Federal Reserve System, the entire world monetary system. So this is how they universalized the Roman Napoleonic Code, civil law, the state of emergency, and the global control of the entire monetary system in the temples slash banks of the god of Janus, whose doors are open when Rome is at war with the people. Okay. Which they had defined a couple of years before by calling it a war on terror, or on Terra, T-A-R-A, which is a classical name for
Yeah.
the earth. So they declared a war on Terra by declaring a war on terror. Okay.
Mhm.
And
Because they created the terror. So,
yeah,
you know.
they created the terror as part of the global trauma system to create the war on the people, to separate the people from their bodies so that they stay out of their body and they'll come into their body, and they're all waiting for some external God to come and save them. So they follow the rules of the law of the priests in order to be good boys and girls. So Santa Claus will give them the gifts, and the priest will give them the final extreme unction when they die, and they are given last rites, rites, which are rituals, which are basically civil rights, right, so they can go into heaven, which is a controlled containment field for recycling and relooping and resetting and all the rest of them. So, so that's basically a brief summary of how we are bound to the law of the priest and how Roman civil law became essentially universalized. So there's the illusion of American English common law or English Commonwealth common law, but it's all ultimately Roman civil law, the law of the priest, the law of military conquest, the law of admiralty and maritime in bankruptcy, and in the rules of containment or management of the conquered territory through Roman conquest. So this is how all that ties together. So back to your question.
You're saying even common law is not our friend at this point.
Well, it is if it's properly understood and integrated with everything. Okay. This is why I refer back to the law form in the court of PanTerra, as I've written it through my expertise over these 30 to 40 years. Because it's not just about saying, well, we're the common law people, blah, blah, blah. It's about what it does to us internally when we start reintegrating our fragmentation, start healing and becoming the scalar wave standing form of holding universal law, as opposed to the externalized astrotheological construct of the two pillars that grants the descent of kingship and the absolute authority of the law of the priest. So, so back to your question. So our work started, my work started, in the early 1990s, studying all of this, integrating it over 20 to 30 years, and coming up, formulating a fully integrated master law course that convey, walk somebody through this education in specific detail, how to create one's private estate and how that estate is essentially established as one's own private society that can be a society of two as a couple. It can be a society of a small number of people as a small community. It can be a society of original people, what we call the tribes of native people, to create a society and a law form that's both consistent with the world system, cannot be attacked because they've never been able to attack PanTerra for the last 20 years, because it follows the law and follows the construct of the law, establishes it within a consistent law form that is consistent with their law form. And so, and then going into status correction. So the answer to your question is, when somebody creates their own, through the master law course, they create their own society and all the elements that directly reflects how the PanTerra Society was created since the early 2000s, and is a decentralized template or structure, but it follows the same law form and the same structure, creating one society, private estates. That is created within the court of the people. So it's not the court of the priest, it's not the court of Melchizedek, it's not the court of the Pope, the Roman Curia, it's a court of the people. And so it is our law and our law form. We stand as the law. And so working within that context, one creates their own society and foundational law form, but can individually express it in any way one wishes to create their own court, their own law, and stand as the law and the court of the people. Then moving into status correction, yes, it starts with the United States system. That's where I was since 91, 90, 91, 92, when I started studying all of this, leading eventually into the 2000 teens of integrating it into the status correction education and course and applications of them. But around 8, 9 years ago, even maybe 10 years ago, we started having other people from other countries come in as members. We had Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Namibians, Rwandans, many, many people from around the world. And they all wanted to follow the same path. Well, to make an extremely long, very complex, very challenging story as short as need be, for the last 10 years, we've been working with our members, first right now for the last 6 to 8 years in Commonwealth countries, primarily what we call the main 5 countries, which is South Africa, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. We have members in each of those countries. We have been going through a long process of transposing and essentially transliterating the US system law form status correction process to align with all Commonwealth countries, which is 143, but starting with the 5 primary ones that I just named. It's been challenging. We've had to deal with a lot of the Commonwealth mindset the mindset and the programming of the subjugation under the crown, all of the inculcation of the belief system, indoctrination into both the royal system, the political system, and the religious system. And but that's been our path of essentially transmuting, transforming, and resolving a lot of massive karma. And at this time, we have some really solid core teams in each of those 5 countries that are working together as a unit through the benefit of the internet and our communication platforms that we use, and transmuting the documents and transforming the documents from the US system to the Commonwealth system. And we're right at that point where we have most of that done, and we have people beginning to take the steps, both in the estate structure and as well as status correction. And over the next months and year, perhaps, we're going to start having a well set system of people in those countries, which will be easily adaptable to all the Commonwealth countries because they're universally hardwired to the same system. The British Empire, the royals, the crown, the Commonwealth, and all of that. There's also a side note to mention that the term British versus the term English are very distinct. There's a lot of information about that, which we won't go into in this conversation. Maybe next time we'll go into it. But basically, the American Revolution was between the British and the English. It wasn't per se the Americans against the British English. And British comes from the original district of Rome called Britannia. So British means a Roman, what's the right word? District, basically.
Yeah.
English is entirely different. English comes through a whole different lineage of history and so forth, dealing with the Romans, dealing with the Vikings, and then the Scandinavians, which actually came from the tribe of Dan, which is why we have Denmark and Sweden and the Danish and so forth. This is the tribe of Dan that came from Egypt during the history of the Hyksos and how it migrated through the Mediterranean and founded the what we know as the Greeks, which was originally called the Danoi, Danoi. It relates to Ireland and the Tuatha de Danann, and how it migrated through the Greek Isles into Rome, the Italian peninsula and the islands, and made its way to the Iberian Peninsula and then up to the Verdant Isles that we call the British Isles. And that was the tribe of Dan, which came from the Hyksos, which relates to the Sumerian history, the Egyptian history, and Babylon, eventually the Roman history. And so there's a lot of that history that very few people really know how to integrate in world history and how it relates to the modern system relative to the American system, who or what was fighting who or what. It's basically the English/American collective, say, fighting the Roman British collective. And then what was put in place as essentially a compromise, because the Americans did not win the Revolutionary War. And there's a lot about that we don't have time for today. But then it has to do with what was established that became the dual mask. We talked about that last time, of the idealization of American freedom, constitutional rights, and all of that, versus the corporate bankrupt structure that started, as we talked about last time, and then eventually moved to integrate around the whole world, as we have now talked about here. So there's a vast amount of detail in real history that very few people really know how it all integrates and how it all fits together. I have been following a path since I was 5 years old of working to integrate all of it. I certainly don't know all of it, but I'm a master puzzler. I know how to hold puzzle pieces, pieces that I encountered when I was 7 years old and 16 and 22. And then when I started studying law and monetary systems, history and religion and esoterica, and how it all fits together. So the education and the practical work in PanTerra and Gemstone is essentially an outpicturing of my organic mind, how I have
Mm,
integrated the puzzle as best as I can up to this point, and how we have structured the education and the practical applications so that we can take back our authority and our power and stop externalizing it into the line of the king to control the land and the line of the priest. And it is all both practical and in law and legal terms, but is also energetic, multidimensional, and within um, universal and eternal terms. We are eternal beings, and those who have the capacity to listen to you and your work and the other people I've recently been talking to that we've done interviews and or my work and numerous others, these are the beings who are real beings who are um, aligned with um, real source creational standing, who are here on the inside of the containment field to re-embody, to heal, to resolve, so that we ripple effect cause the hologram to be reforming itself, recreating itself to a world that honors all of life and all living beings. So
mm-hmm.
back to your
Well
question,
said.
this is how it relates. It's a work in progress. We need as many people who feel aligned with it to come on into PanTerra, begin the walk through the education and join our teams, whether you're in South Africa or the UK or wherever, and including European countries, because once we really finish the English Commonwealth forms of status correction and start implementing it, we've already been implementing it in various ways in most of those countries, which I'll come back to in a minute. But talking about Latin America and Europe, Roman civil law countries, we are getting very close to being able to start cracking that code because it's the same code. It's the same pattern of Roman military conquest, the imposition of Roman civil law, control and contain, dominate and control, and get people to entrain themselves to acquiesce through their own sovereign free will to enter into contracts to become part of the hive mind Borg system, transhumanistic harvest system, which is designed to harvest as many beings to take them into what's about to happen in the next couple of decades into the collapse mode and the reset, which has happened many, many times, versus the real beings who actually remove all that overlay and retain the standing in a real world that we will have the capacity to create within our own co-creative capacity. So it's a work in progress, and we really need as many people who are aligned with what we've talked about to come join us and help in the work, because it takes a lot of hands, hearts, minds, and beings to do this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a coming together of we the people to create a new world ultimately. And
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for the tireless work that you've been doing over the last 30 odd years. You are a walking encyclopedia. We can probably go on for days, and I'm sure a lot of this information is covered in the Gemstone University. So, guys, go
Yeah,
check
it
it
is.
out. It's a wealth of information.
But this is a great way to be able to vocalize it and walk people through it. And most people who have watched me over the years, my interviews or solo recordings, know that I wax poetically and metaphorically, literally and contextually into a lot of areas where I'm talking about one thing, Roman civil law, then I mentioned the tribe of Dan and goes back to Sumer and this and that, the other. I do that purposefully I do it because what we need to do is break down the linear time-space construct of the
Mm-hmm.
chronological containment field, which also gets into a lot of the detail of the legends of the gods and mythology, Kronos, Saturn, all of that, which we can get into later in our future discussions. Um,
Mm.
and when I do that, and I speak multidimensionally, I am creating a spherical um, presence that, in a way, forces people to let go of the linear construct of what they think they know.
Hmm.
What most
Yeah.
people think they know is, by and large, programming. Okay. We have
Mm.
to be deprogrammed and break that down to allow our true being to start being able to see with realize how the whole system really works, how it all fits together. That's what my
Mm-hmm.
life path has been about for 65 years. That's what the whole educational forum in Gemstone, Gem University, what that's all about, everything that we've talked about. A lot of people have come in, they have a first flush of excitement, they resonate with what I say or the work and so forth, but they get pushed back because they go into, reactive resistance. That reactive
Mm-hmm.
resistance is the holding on to what's familiar in the programming throughout our lives. It's the mechanical mind that's hardwired to the AI mind that has a lot of levels that we're not aware of that control how we see reality. When we start feeling that our safe zone that we adhered to stay alive in the matrix starts being challenged, a lot of people react. A lot of people have attacked us with those reactions internally within our
Mm.
society and externally. So
Mm-hmm.
this is where the persistence of one's inner being has to come into play. Because as you break through those points of resistance, one's reality construct starts breaking apart. Well, that reality construct is the movie that we're projecting to support and sustain the matrix that is our prison. We created our
Yeah.
prison. They are parasites. They can't create. They entrain
Yeah.
what they know in our internal being into an obverse mirroring so that we are entrained to create what their movie is, what their agenda is. So those levels of reaction, resistance, polarization, those are good signs to know that you're coming up against your own programming, but you have to work your way through that. And that's where the real work comes. So it's about a breakdown and then the breakthrough so that
Mm-hmm.
you start entering into a real world, a real reality. And the more that we do that in a unified field as a collective body, that we have the use of artificial technology through being able to talk to each other, through this device around the world. You're in South Africa. We can bring in somebody from Australia or, you know, Europe, Africa, whatever. So we have these devices that are designed to control and contain us, but they're also there to be our directive principle to break our programming down and rebuild a unified field. That's where we're at right now. That's the cusp that we're out. We're at a world convergence, as we can all see, militarily, psychologically, in the control matrix of the last phase of the cabal agenda to contain the whole herd on a global planetation into a harvesting mode, because that's really where we're at. And we can talk about that next time. What does that really mean?
Mm-hmm.
How does that really work? How does it relate to everything we've talked about in the law of the king and the priest and the lifting off the land and so forth? Where are we at in this epoch of a period of a beginning and an end in an artificial containment in time and space construct that does have an endpoint? And that endpoint leads to where we're at, which is the harvesting, the entrainment and the harvesting of as many beings, including the primary beings, the real beings who are the backbone of the creational capacity here, that we have voluntarily agreed to, because we are here to ultimately break that system down. That's what we're doing right now. The matrix is imploding. As I said before, it will not be able to hold into their event, their agenda for harvest and reset. And that's the work that we're doing now. That's why we're now
Mhm.
starting to really come together.
Mm. Absolutely fascinating. Um, I'm excited to talk about the other subjects. There's so much to cover. But this has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Ken, for your wealth of information shared so eloquently and weaving it all together so it makes sense. And yeah, I look forward to unpacking lots more with you over the weeks and months to come.
Yeah.
And as you say, we are here to break the false matrix, and we are doing that every day with every single action. And we just have to choose in every moment how we respond, and to be that neutral observer and realize that we are not a victim of this matrix. We are the creators of this matrix. So we just got to change the
Yeah.
programming and start changing our environment, and
Yeah.
it will
Well, we just have to
self-implode ultimately.
We have to change the script because it is a script, and we're living
Yeah.
at the end point of their script. And their script is interwoven into these things that they've got us believing are scriptures that they say is holy because they're the word of God or so forth. And so, but we're the scribes. We are the ones who ultimately have the power and the authority to write a new script. So this is
Mm,
where the work is to really be here, embody in one's landed estate in a unified field with other standing beings who have broken down the programming, essentially dissolved the false narrative script, and we are now scripting a true universal script that eschews the concept of scriptures from anything quote unquote above us. We are it. We are the writers of the script. We just have to regain our capacity to be the directive principle to actually be directing the writing of that new script. A large part of that has to do with the separation, the splitting, separation, polarization of the masculine principle and the feminine principle. Essentially, the masculine principle, it's not patriarchal dominance, it's actually directive will. And if you look at how the whole world has been debased to give its will to the priests and the kings, that we have become willless. And so we do not direct who's writing the script. We're following somebody else's story, history, and script because we have not because this is where all the chemicals come in, the whole transgender thing, the emasculation, the ineffectual masculine that does not stand for life, does not protect the feminine principle. Feminine principle is regenerative. It is the eternal creational principle of life itself. It emerges out of what we can call source. We are source connected beings. It emerges out of us. And so most beings have been programmed to basically subjugate or debase that feminine principle. And then we see it in lots of things, religion, culture, and all of that. And it goes back to the Judeo-Christian origination storyline. It's Melchizedek, Melchi, in the Aramaic languages, Arabic and Hebrew. Melchi or derivatives means king. Zadok was the primary priesthood. So Melchizedek or Melchizedek is the king priest. And the king priest, known as Melchizedek in the Old Testament, did what? He took over or he overlaid the control through the patriarchy of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is derived from two words, Uru and Shalem. Shalem is the root etymologically of the word shalom, which basically means life, which means peace, means equity, means balance. That's the feminine regenerative principle. Uru comes from the Scandinavian languages, made its way through the British Isles, the Verdant Isles, and made its way across northern Africa to the Middle East. And basically, Uru means founding, the founding. So Uru Shalem means the founding of the feminine, of peace, of equity, of balance, of universal law, of eternity, life as eternity. So the Melchizedek, the patriarch, overlaid it, handed it off to Abram, who then became Abraham. Ab means the father. It also means the servant of Ra, Ab Ra, or the servant of
Mm.
the solar principle, the solar god from Egypt, known as Ra, who traveled the sky in his bark or his ship. Okay, so Ab Ra, when he accepted the mind control, trauma-induced covenant with Yahweh, when Yahweh said, kill your firstborn son, and killing the firstborn son, whether it's a human or it's a sacrificial animal, basically is a dominant control, energetic capture of the ancestral lineage. Okay, so and it was done on the rock that later became the Rock of Peter, but originated as the rock or the basis of Ptah, who was known as the universal creator, which is a derivative of the god Ra. And so Abra became Abraham, and Ham basically means a village or a community. So the Abrahamic covenant is a mind control induced trauma relationship of emasculating the masculine principle to then create the Abrahamic tripartite Judeo-Christian structure, which is always a matter of threes. They're false trinity, the three city states and all the rest of it. And then Melchizedek, who conquered the feminine and established the overlay of the patriarch over life, handed off to Abram, who became Abraham, which then became the patriarchal covenant to control the population, the congregation, through the law of the priest. And so that's that's the whole point. That's the separation and the polarization of what is a unified being who is balanced with the masculine and the feminine principles, directive capacity as will to manifest creation, and the regenerative capacity to stand as a eternal pillar, a standing wave of life, whether in incarnate form or in a universal context. And that's been the name of the game. Divide and conquer, polarize the masculine and feminine, use races and ethnicities and religions and creeds to create all that we see today. So that's the work we have individually to reintegrate, heal, and balance ourselves, and it will remanifest into this a new expression of this creational field.
Mm. Absolutely fascinating. I'd like to dive into that subject a little bit deeper as well in one of the
Yeah.
episodes, because I think there's so much confusion around that and so many stories and different angles. It'll be definitely worth diving into that subject and um, yeah, sort of what is the word? Sort of I can't think of the word right now, but demystify a lot of the
Yeah.
stories that are
Unveil,
perhaps not the
unveil.
truth.
It's
Unveil.
unveil. Yeah.
Yeah.
So everybody thinks Revelation is the way to go, the book of Revelations, but Revelation means to reveal. Okay.
Reveal.
Okay. So we're not seeking revelation. We're working with the uh, inherent capacity to unveil, to break the veils so that we can see reality for the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
So yeah,
See clearly the
unveiling is
glory.
what we're doing here.
Yeah.
And so what I would suggest is let's have a transcript made of this discussion, and then we could pull, there's a lot of points in here. We can pull out each point and make a list of our future discussions to cover.
Mhm.
There's a lot
Yeah,
of things in here we can talk for a very long time about.
indeed, indeed. And all very fascinating and necessary to unpack. Well, thank you so much for bringing all of this information, Ken. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to the next one. And everyone, I'll leave the links below. Go and check it out. PanTerra Vida's website, Gem University, see what it all entails. There's a great Substack as well that Ken has that has loads of information. So
And
is it
that's
a Substack
freedom.
or a Patreon? Substack, right?
Well, it's both Patreon and Substack. Freedomabsolute.substack.com. And I don't know how Patreon does its thing. Is it at Patreon/Freedom Absolute? I'm not sure, but
I'll have the link in the show notes
yeah,
for
we'll do the
everyone.
links. And yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Anina. It's always
Till the
great to
next
talk to
time.
you. Yeah, let me
Thanks,
know. We'll
everyone.
schedule it. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it and look
Yeah,
forward to the
thanks for
next.
paying attention for such a long time. I'm sure, like me, you could listen for a few more hours, but we'll leave it at this for now. And until the next time, thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.